Welcome to the Level 3 Award in Emergency First Aid at Work. In this section we are going to have a wee chat about the roles and responsibilities of the first aider. The 3 P's of first aid are preserving life, prevent deterioration and promoting recovery. In terms of preserving life, that will involve us doing a scene safety check. So there's no point in us as first aiders becoming a second casualty that somebody else needs to deal with. Second part of that will be doing what's known as a primary survey, so that's establishing if there are any life-threatening conditions that the casualty might have. So primarily establishing is the casualty breathing or not, and that may well lead to us having to do life-saving emergency first aid. So for example, if the casualty is not breathing, then we need to administer CPR. In terms of preventing deterioration, that is once we've established that there's no life-threatening conditions in the casualty, then we can assess for other injuries or illnesses that, if we don't do something about, may result in the casualty being in a life-threatening condition in the future. And that will involve us doing what's known as a secondary survey, which we'll go into more detail about later. And in this situation, it might involve us doing emergency first aid, so it's not about having to save the casualty's life at this point, but it is about us providing some sort of first aid to the casualty. In terms of promoting recovery, that's about us relieving discomfort or anxiety in the casualty. So in terms of our casualty management, if you like, a big part of our role as first aiders is reassuring the casualty. The calmer the casualty is, then the better the quality information we can get from the casualty, and therefore be able to determine what exactly is wrong with the casualty and take the appropriate steps in terms of administering first aid. The promote recovery part will also be conducted at a hospital by doctors and nurses, and also by paramedics in the ambulance on the way to hospital if that's necessary. So the chain of survival just highlights that our role as first aiders is actually really important, so we can recognise early that the casualty is in need of assistance and phone for help, and potentially that could limit the chance that the casualty goes into cardiac arrest. If we need to and the casualty is unconscious and not breathing, then we can administer early CPR, which just buys our casualty a wee bit more time for the ambulance to arrive with a defibrillator, which will hopefully restore normal heart function. And if there's a defibrillator on site, then actually we can use that and administer a shock to the casualty, which is the only thing that's going to restore normal heart function. So CPR in itself will not restart the heart. And those first 2 steps, or indeed 3 steps of the chain, are really important. Otherwise the post-resuscitation care bit, so the bit that happens in hospital, can't actually take place, because let's face it, the casualty's actually not made it to that point, and essentially they've died, they've not made it. There's some legal considerations that we need to take as first aiders regarding tablets and medication, duty of care, negligence, consent and recording, and we're going to go through each of these in a wee bit more detail. So our duty of care as an emergency first aider or as a sports first aider is towards our casualties, and that duty of care is to exercise reasonable care and skill in providing first aid treatment. In the unlikely event that a first aider is sued in connection with providing first aid assistance, the courts would look at the circumstances surrounding the event to see if the first aider had acted negligently in the way that first aid was provided. As a first aider, we should always ask for and receive casualties' consent before we administer any first aid treatment. If the casualty is unconscious or unable to give consent due to their injuries, then we can assume consent and commence treatment. So that might be that the casualty is unconscious and not breathing and can't give consent, and also covers us if the casualty can't make that decision for themselves. So for example, if they've had a head injury, for example, or if they have a learning difficulty or disability that prevents them from being able to make that decision for themselves. The accident report should always state that consent was received. We can always assume consent for all children, so anybody under the age of 16 in Scotland, but we should still ask them for their consent and just get that verbally. If the casualty refuses treatment, we need to ensure that we document that on our accident report form or in our accident book, and make sure we have a witness statement to confirm this as well, and explain any changes to the ambulance, such as the casualty not wanting to receive treatment if it's something serious that we've had to phone an ambulance for. Record keeping as a first aider is really important, so we must keep accurate records in an accident book or an incident log. This might be a paper accident book, and then that information might be transferred onto an electronic or online system. We also need to keep an accurate patient report form, and that helps the emergency services, so the EMS, just to establish exactly what's happened to the casualty, what's wrong with them, and what treatment we've provided. The accident book is a legal document, so it can be used in a court of law. It must be completed in ink, so that it can't be rubbed out or changed afterwards, and it must have the casualty's occupation on it. Now, this is really important, because if the casualty was found in an area of the workplace where they shouldn't have been, or they were operating a piece of equipment, for example, that they haven't had training for, then it's really important that that casualty's occupation has been documented in the accident book. The reporting of injuries, diseases and dangerous occurrences regulations of 1997 are really the responsibility of the whole health and safety officer to report, but they need to be informed of any instances that fall under the RIDA regulations. The employer must report a death, a major injury, so something like a significant head injury or a fracture, accidents that result in 3 or more days off work, any dangerous occurrences and any diseases. So we would all have been familiar with that in terms of the reporting of close contacts through the COVID pandemic. It's important as a first aider that we maintain patient or casualty confidentiality, so any information in terms of details of treatment provided, medical conditions, the results of any tests are confidential information that shouldn't be passed on to anybody else. So the personal information about the health of the worker is confidential. That information should only be passed on to appropriate personnel, so for example, ambulance crew when they arrive. We have now come to the end of the section on roles and responsibilities. It's just a time for you guys to pause and reflect. If you have any questions, please make a note of these. You can bring these with you to your practical day and they'll be answered by your tutor assessor, or you can use the discussion forum within Canvas to post a question